Hello guys, obviously this isn't a traditional podcast episode because I'm actually doing this just handheld on my phone, so the audio quality might not be the best, and I'm going to try and be as brief as I possibly can. But right now I'm stood in Sefton Park. Sefton Park, if you're not aware, it's Liverpool's second largest public park. Something I get questioned on quite often on tours is I say second largest public park because it is. Croxteth Park is Liverpool's largest park, just so you know that for future reference if anyone's interested in little trivia facts about the city. But yet Sefton Park is Liverpool's second largest, but it is the largest municipal park to be precise. It's also just around the corner from Penny Lane, so it did play a very important part in the early story of the Beatles. I say the early story of the Beatles, mainly just the lads' lives. You know, Ringo Starr played truant from school here because he missed out on most of his education because he was sick. Paul McCartney would have memories on the Sefton Park boating lake. He'd have memories with John as well on the Sefton Park boating lake because John Lennon and Paul would go out on the boats on the Sefton Park boating lake and then try and not bring them back. They'd stay there as long as they possibly could. Even when they were getting shouted back in, they'd stay out there. Paul McCartney's a fantastic image that Mike McCartney took, and he only released it just a few years ago, which is Paul like rowing on the boating lake, so it's quite cool. Paul McCartney would go on to say that he'd come and watch bands playing at the Sefton Park bandstand. He later said it was that gave him the concept idea of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I just love that one. It's considered to be the greatest album in history. And John Lennon's mum and dad met for the first ever time at the Sefton Park boating lake, and the boating lake is just over there. Okay, so that's the Sefton Park boating lake. They met for the first time. The story goes, which is quite cute, Alf was wearing a silly bowler hat and a suit, and he was walking along the side of the lake and he got chatting to Julia. He started trying to chat her up at the side of the lake, and she started laughing at him because of the hat he was wearing. He said, "If I take it off and throw it in the lake, do you want to go on a date with me?" She said, "Yeah, come on." So that's how it went, you know, famously. It's a story that Alf would share, of course, years later. But a little hidden gem, but probably the most significant thing about Sefton Park and the Beatles is the fact that Stuart Sutcliffe lived here. There's a little blue plaque on the door of the Sefton Park Hotel. It's where Stuart Sutcliffe lived. And that's really quite significant, isn't it? Because a Beatle literally lived in Sefton Park. Stuart Sutcliffe, if you know the way, he was the fifth Beatle. Originally born in Scotland, he would move to Liverpool in his teens with his family. And then he'd actually moved to Percy Street, and that's where John Lennon met him. John Lennon went to art college. Famously, John was not good in school. Always getting told off, told he would amount to nothing. He was destined for failure. But what he would do is he would go to art college and he'd meet Stuart. He'd meet Cynthia Powell, his first wife, as well. But Stuart was such an essential part of the early story of the Beatles because Stuart was John's best friend. Now, by all accounts, and you'll read many different accounts about Stuart, some people would say he wasn't the best at playing bass guitar, but the reality of it is Stuart was an artist, a very good artist as well. Kind of pioneering at that time in pop art. You know, he was kind of at the forefront of that, really, even before his time. But Stuart was he was John's best friend, and one day Stuart wins an art competition at John Moore's, and John convinces him to buy a bass guitar just to join the band. Now, at this point as well in Beatles history, you've got to remember things are really shaky. This is just a group of teenage lads who are playing gigs, realistically, but they're playing the Casbah and places like that, but they're not really getting regular gigs in other places. And all of a sudden John Lennon decides, you know, let's just go to the Jacaranda and just ask them if we can start getting gigs there, and chats to Alan Williams. Alan Williams gets them a tour of Scotland, an audition with Larry Parnes, and then from there what happens is John and Stuart are in the band, and it's almost like it's John and Stuart's band. Paul McCartney almost seems like an accessory from everything I've ever read. Maybe Paul starts getting a little bit jealous about that. Who knows? People can read into that as much as they wish. But George is, of course, still the young one in the band, with lads who are in art college, you know, while he's in high school. So this is an interesting time for the Beatles, where it's really just a group of teenage lads making it up. Nowadays, we immortalise the story, of course we do, because it's the Beatles and everything's got to be fact by fact and date by date. But these are teenage lads, and Stuart's in the band. He's got himself a bass guitar. John's trying to teach him how to play it. I think Paul's helping him out as well. But in the end, they get sent off to Hamburg in Germany. Alan Williams is getting asked to send bands over there. And the reason why is because apparently the German bands were absolutely awful by all accounts. So promoters like the likes of Bruno Koschmider, for example, he would be contacting London and Liverpool, but the London bands are quite expensive. But the Liverpool bands were very heavily influenced by American rock and roll because, of course, we're connected with the United States, with the port. So this becomes a really important story of the Beatles because they go over to Hamburg, John, Paul, George, Pete Best and Stuart Sutcliffe. And when they're over there, they're playing for between 8 and 10 hours a night. They start to take drugs as well. They take prellies, uppers, and so they can stay awake as long as possible and play the music. It's an intense part of the Beatles' history because they were playing for long hours, sleeping in awful conditions. But Stuart was an essential part of that story. But going back just before the Hamburg part, John and Stuart were in art college together. And when they were in art college together, John and Stuart were the kind of feeling like their band. They're the ones that are coming up with a name, Because before then, they're the Quarrymen. They changed the name to Johnny and the Moondogs. From Johnny and the Moondogs, they go towards the Silver Beatles. And one of the reasons why is because they love Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And Buddy Holly and the Crickets, they played on Hope Street. They played there in 1958, and John and Stuart were in art college at that time, and Paul and George were obviously in the school, which was on the street too. Buddy Holly plays a huge part in the story. Why they were called the Beatles was thanks to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. But I'm telling you this because at some point, and I personally think it was in Gambier Terrace, John and Stuart decide to drop the silver and drop the double E on the Beatles. They make it Beatles with an A. And I think it was in Gambier Terrace where they came up with that name categorically. But it was Stuart. It was, he was involved in that decision. It was John and Stuart. This wasn't really a George or Paul decision. And George Harrison really confirms that in the anthology when he's asked about it. He goes towards instantly talking about Gambier Terrace, and then he kind of goes off on another tangent. Does George talk about Marlon Brando and the gang called the Beatles who are in the film? But John and Stuart loved Marlon Brando. And of course James Dean as well, so that was a massive impact at that particular time. But listen, I'm freezing here and it's windy, so I don't even know how the audio is picking up, but I'm going to go inside the hotel because it's got the right to look around the place. Let's have a little look. A video with no microphones, actually. Okay, so I'm in the hotel, and by the way, they've started to basically curate the walls of the place. Got some artwork by Shannon. Love Shannon. Her artwork's all over the Hard Day's Night Hotel, by the way, if you've never seen it. So it's incredible artwork. But there's loads of pieces of art, and there's copies and replicas of the letters that were sent. So you've got letters from John. You've got this, which is an incredible image. In fact, lead me to the next thing that I want to tell you about, which is the Beatles go to Hamburg. They make a very good name for themselves. But probably one of the most important things they do when they're in Hamburg is they form a relationship with two people. One of them is Klaus Voormann. Klaus Voormann, very important part of the story of the Beatles, because Klaus Voormann, he ends up playing bass with most of the lads in their solo careers, not Paul McCartney, to my knowledge. But he plays with George, plays it with John. He also designs the Revolver album cover. So Klaus was such an important part of the story. However, Astrid Kirchherr was probably one of the most important figures in the history of the Beatles. So it's a beautiful work here of Shannon once again. So this is a painting, by the way. She's just incredibly realistic with what she does. But yeah, that's Astrid Kirchherr. And Astrid, she was an exie, an existentialist. That was a subculture of art students who were in Hamburg at that particular time. So at that time, in terms of British culture, there was mods and rockers, of course. But they were exies, existentialists. And she'd have a little short haircut, which would go on to be the Beatle haircut. Now, at first, it would be Stuart and George who would have that haircut, and it was inspired by Astrid. Astrid would give them the haircut, and John and Paul would later follow with the mop top. And then eventually when Ringo joined the band, he had to have the mop top because it was part of the image. But Astrid was the inspiration behind it, and Stuart was also the groundbreaker of it, because Stuart formed an intimate relationship with Astrid. So Stuart and Astrid would actually start a relationship. they meet on the first trip. By the time Stuart was on the second trip, that was it. He'd fell in love with Astrid and he was wanting to stay there. He'd also started doing his art in Hamburg, so he would leave the Beatles to stay behind in Hamburg because he'd fell in love. And I love that. It's such a almost poetic, beautiful thing that Stuart would leave the band that went on to become the greatest band in history because he fell in love. You know, I think it's a beautiful, poetic thing, and it certainly is a lovely thing for an artist as well. But yeah, the Sefton Park Hotel is really cool at the moment because they've got all the artwork up. Like, that's brilliant. That's a photo, of course, but it's a great shot. But here on the top floor, you'll just see loads of pieces of Stuart Sutcliffe artwork. Of course, it's not the originals; it's replicas. Yeah, here you go. There's this one as well. Stuart's beautiful, isn't it? But yeah, they're doing incredible things here at the hotel. So it's really quite a cool thing. They've invited me into it today, so I can do some video content recording for them. Not necessarily like this with the podcast, so this isn't a sponsored or paid thing. I'm actually just wanting to do this because it's my first time walking around the hallways of the hotel. I've been in the foyer before, but not the hallways. But they've asked me to come in to actually record a video that can be shown inside the hotel itself, so it's quite cool. But yeah, Stuart lived here. When I say Stuart lived here, his family lived here. So Mark Lewisham kind of puts the date at 1961 that they would move in. So if you're familiar with the history of the Beatles, and I've done many videos in which I'm kind of chronologically telling and sharing the story of the Beatles, you are looking at the lads going over to Hamburg in 1960, the August of 1960. So his family aren't, to my knowledge, here at that point, but all of a sudden by 1961, late 1961, they are here. So when Stuart's coming back from Hamburg in between trips, this is the house he's coming to, because at that point it seems like they've left Gambier Terrace. Stuart Sutcliffe's sister, Pauline, does actually share some stories in which she remembers John coming around to the house. But it would be at this house where Astrid Kirchherr would come and visit with an orchard in her hand, to try and impress the Sutcliffe family and try and get on their side. And to my knowledge, she does. But later accounts would kind of conflict at the same time. So it's a very interesting thing, the history of the Beatles, trying to dissect it. But this is where Stuart Sutcliffe lived in Liverpool, the fifth Beatle. But yeah, Stuart would tragically pass away due to a brain aneurysm. So he did leave the Beatles because he fell in love, but he would pass away tragically. Devastating John Lennon, of course. More devastation in John Lennon's life. For anyone who has studied John's life, you know, he loses his Uncle George at 15. He's like a father figure to him. He would then lose his mother by 17. He'd then become best friends with Stuart, and then Stuart would pass away just before Beatlemania begins. He never enjoys Beatlemania. By the end of the Beatles, he falls out with Paul McCartney quite publicly. It's only like 5 years of John Lennon's life where he finds genuine peace, which was sort of 1975 until 1980. And then when he makes his big return back to music in December 1980, he's shot and killed outside the Dakota Building in New York City. John has such a tragic life, but it feels weird in a way to talk about John Lennon. But obviously John is John Lennon. He's such an amazing figure in history. But his best friend was Stuart, and Stuart was such an essential part in the story of the Beatles. So listen, I would highly recommend everything I see so far at the Sefton Park Hotel. Obviously, if not staying in the rooms, I would recommend coming here and visiting. But yeah, on tours, I am going to start including visiting the Sefton Park Hotel on my tours. So if you want to book a private tour, get in touch with me, give me a shout. But yeah, there you have it. 15 minutes of walking around the Sefton Park Hotel where Stuart Sutcliffe lived.